Welcome to this lecture on the history of ethology. Imagine you are sitting in a park, watching a squirrel carefully bury a nut. You might ask yourself, how does it know to do that? For thousands of years, humans have asked these exact questions. Today, we will explore how this simple curiosity evolved into a rigorous scientific field, and why understanding the history of animal behavior is essential for modern biology. To begin our journey, we must look back to the very origins of human existence. Early humans did not study animals for academic reasons. They did it to survive. They needed to know the habits of mammoths and deer to feed their families, making the observation of animal behavior arguably the oldest science in human history. Over time, this survival skill transformed. During the pre-scientific era, ancient philosophers like Aristotle began to think about animal actions more systematically, laying the earliest groundwork for what would eventually become a formal scientific discipline. Moving forward from ancient philosophy, we arrive at the formal definition of our subject. Ethology is the scientific and objective study of animal behavior, specifically focusing on how animals act in their natural environments. The modern scientific era of this field truly blossomed in the 1930s. It was established by three brilliant scientists: Konrad Lorenz, Nico Tinbergen, and Carl von Frisch. Their groundbreaking work was so revolutionary that they eventually shared a Nobel Prize. They fundamentally changed how we view the animal kingdom, shifting our perspective from mere observation to rigorous scientific analysis. Now that we know who founded modern ethology, we must understand the major shift they introduced to the scientific method. Before these pioneers came along, scientists mostly studied animals locked in sterile laboratory cages. As you might imagine, this often led to unnatural, stressed, and confusing behavioral results. The history of ethology is essentially the story of moving scientists out of the laboratory and into the wild. By observing animals in their natural evolutionary homes, researchers could finally see the true, unforced nature of animal behavior, leading to much more accurate and meaningful discoveries. You might wonder why we need to study the history of how people watched animals in the past. Understanding this history is crucial because it teaches us to avoid the mistakes of early researchers, such as assuming animals are just mindless machines, or conversely, treating them exactly like human beings. Today, the principles discovered by early ethologists are used every single day in wildlife conservation, zoo management, and even domestic dog training. Furthermore, studying how ethology evolved helps us understand the biological roots of our own human behaviors, beautifully bridging the gap between biology and psychology. This historical foundation brings us to one of the most significant conflicts in the field. While history is usually a timeline of events, the ultimate result of the history of ethology was resolving a massive, decades-long debate between genetics and environment. Early scientists argued bitterly over whether behaviors were entirely hardwired from birth or entirely learned from the animal's surroundings. The historical resolution of this intense debate gave us a foundational conceptual formula that modern ethologists use to define any animal behavior, proving that the answer was not one or the other, but a combination of both. To resolve the debate we just discussed, scientists developed a conceptual formula. This equation serves as the bedrock of all modern animal behavior studies. The formula states that B equals a function of G E, and G times E. Let us break this down. The variable B represents the specific animal behavior being observed, like a bird singing. The variable G stands for the genetic makeup or inherited instincts. The variable E represents the environmental factors and learned experiences. Finally, the term G times E represents the complex, inseparable interaction between the animal's genes and its environment. If the genetic component increases, the behavior becomes more rigid and instinctual. If the environmental component increases, the behavior relies more on flexible learning. Now that we have our conceptual formula, let us look at a famous historical example to see how it works in practice. In the 1930s, the pioneer Konrad Lorenz discovered a fascinating phenomenon called imprinting. He observed that baby geese will follow the first moving object they see immediately after hatching. We need to determine how the genetic component and the environmental component interact to produce this famous following behavior. By breaking down this historical discovery step by step, we can see exactly how instincts and environment are permanently linked in the animal's brain. Let us apply our behavior function to Lorenz's experiment. We start by identifying what is given. First, we assign the innate, hardwired urge to follow a moving object to our genetic variable, G1. Next, we assign the specific object the baby goose actually sees, which happen to be Konrad Lorenz's large boots, to our environmental variable, E1. We then combine these two distinct inputs into our function. Because both variables are present and interacting, the function successfully outputs the final behavior. The final result is that the baby geese treated Konrad Lorenz as their mother and followed him absolutely everywhere. This proves that the genetic urge alone is not enough without an environmental trigger to activate it. Having seen how imprinting works, we now turn to our second historical example, which heavily influenced animal behavior studies. In the 1890s, Ivan Pavlov conducted famous experiments with dogs. Pavlov noticed something unusual. His dogs would start salivating, not just when they ate food, but when they simply heard the footsteps of the person bringing the food, or the sound of a bell. We want to understand how a completely unnatural sound becomes linked to a natural, biological response. To do this, we will analyze this salivation behavior using our conceptual behavior function. Let us map Pavlov's observations directly to our variables. The natural reflex of salivating when tasting food is a purely biological, inherited trait, so we assign this to our genetic variable, G2. The sound of the ringing bell is a completely external, learned association, so we assign this to our environmental variable, E2. We then combine them in our function to model how the conditioned response is formed. The final outcome is that the dogs would drool simply at the sound of a bell, even if no food was present. This demonstrates that by manipulating the environmental variable, we can drastically alter the behavioral output, introducing the concept of associative learning to the scientific world. To bring all these historical milestones together, let us look at this timeline diagram. At the top, you can see a visual representation of our conceptual equation. The boxes for genetics and environment both feed directly into animal behavior, showing that they are permanently linked. Below this, we have the historical timeline. It starts in the 1890s with Ivan Pavlov's work on classical conditioning. Moving forward, we see the 1930s, marking Konrad Lorenz's discovery of imprinting. Finally, it points toward the 1950s with Nico Tinbergen. This diagram beautifully summarizes how our understanding of the interaction between genetics and environment evolved over decades of rigorous scientific observation. We have covered a lot of ground today, so let us review our key takeaways. First, we learned that ethology evolved from the simple survival observations of early humans into a rigorous, objective science. Second, we saw how pioneers like Lorenz and Pavlov revolutionized the field by moving research out of sterile laboratories and into natural habitats, or by discovering fundamental learning mechanisms. Finally, and most importantly, we discovered that all animal behavior is a beautiful, complex mixture of genetic instincts and environmental learning. Remembering this history helps us appreciate the incredible depth of animal intelligence and the long scientific journey that revealed it to us. Thank you for watching.